The day he walked into our house, the weather outside was unsettlingly calm, too still for a spring morning, the kind of silence that sits heavy on your chest, as if it knows something you don't. My husband had left early for the airport, muttering about traffic and missed calls, giving me the usual peck on the cheek that felt more like a ritual than affection. He'd mentioned the night before, casually, that his son from a previous marriage would be staying with us for a while. Just a couple of weeks, he had said, scrolling through his emails. He needs a place to land while he sorts out this job thing. I hadn't seen him in years, not since his awkward teenage summers when he would visit with a mix of boredom and obligation. Now he was an adult. When I opened the door that morning and saw him standing there with a worn duffel bag slung over one shoulder and tired eyes shaded by quiet confidence, I was caught off guard. Not by his appearance, though he was striking in a way I hadn't expected, but by the unfamiliar ripple it stirred in me. He smiled politely, stepping into the hallway, and suddenly the house felt smaller. His cologne was subtle, something woody and clean, mixing with the faint scent of rain clinging to his jacket. I guided him toward the guest room, making small talk about the flight, the neighborhood, the weather. He listened more than he spoke, nodding, watching. I felt his gaze linger just a second too long when I turned my back to open the linen closet. Not inappropriate, just observant. It unsettled me, and I hated how aware I became of my posture, the curve of my hips beneath the soft fabric of my robe. The first full day passed in a blur of polite boundaries. I cooked breakfast. He offered to help clean up. We danced around each other with the careful civility of strangers forced into a domestic arrangement. But something shifted that afternoon when I returned from the garden, hands dirty from potting soil, and found him sitting on the back steps smoking a cigarette he didn't bother to finish. He looked up and smiled, and it was the kind of smile that doesn't ask for anything, just acknowledges a shared space. Still, I felt it too deeply. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual. I brushed my hair slower. I checked the strap of my nightgown, even though no one would see it. My husband's side of the bed was empty. He wouldn't be back until Friday. I slipped under the sheets alone, but I didn't sleep well. Not because of guilt, not even because of fear, but because my skin wouldn't settle. It tingled. It remembered too much from too little. The next morning, I woke early and moved quietly through the kitchen, still in my robe, the one with the loose tie that always seemed to shift open no matter how often I adjusted it. I hadn't expected him to be up. But there he was, barefoot, leaning against the counter, drinking water from a glass like he belonged here. He looked at me and said, "You always up this early?" And I said yes, though that wasn't true. We spent the morning avoiding real conversation. He stayed mostly in his room. I wandered between tasks that didn't need doing. But sometime in the afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the guest room, his room, he walked in. I turned, startled, holding one of his shirts, and he said, "Sorry. Didn't mean to sneak up on you." He didn't leave. I didn't ask him to. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching me quietly. The room felt too warm. The air changed. I tried to ignore the way his presence changed my breathing, but my body betrayed me. Subtle, involuntary reactions. My fingers tightening around fabric, the back of my neck flushing for no reason. "What do you do when you're not being a perfect wife?" he asked, smiling like it was a joke. "I'm not perfect," I said too quickly. He tilted his head. "No, but you try hard. Doesn't that get exhausting?" I folded the shirt in my hands too neatly. "What about you? You always this curious?" He leaned back slightly, looking up at the ceiling like he might laugh, but didn't. "Only when I feel like there's something worth figuring out." There was a pause between us. Not empty, not awkward. Heavy with questions neither of us wanted to answer yet. He stood up finally, brushed past me as he left the room, and I was left with the smell of his skin on the cotton in my hands. Later that evening, I passed by the living room. He was watching something muted on TV, sprawled on the couch with a blanket thrown over his lap. I stopped in the hallway, unnoticed, and watched the side of his face, lit faintly by the blue flicker of the screen. I should have gone upstairs. I should have done so many things differently. Instead, I went to bed with my body humming again, my skin sensitive to the memory of nothing at all, just glances, silence, proximity. And yet I knew something had begun. Not something romantic, not yet, but something physical, visceral, inescapably alive. I didn't want to admit that I was looking forward to seeing him at breakfast, and I didn't want to wonder whether he felt the same. But I did. The next morning, I chose a different robe. Silk, pale blue, one I hadn't worn in months. It clung differently, whispered with every movement. Not revealing, but honest. I didn't tell myself why I reached for it. I didn't need to. The fabric knew. My reflection knew. My body, quiet for too long, responded like it remembered something I had tried to forget. He was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, barefoot again, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. The light through the curtains framed him in gold, and for a moment I thought he looked too young to make me feel this way. But he wasn't. He wasn't a boy. Not anymore. He turned when he heard me, eyes flicking briefly to the neckline of my robe, then back to my face. Nothing was said, but something passed between us. An acknowledgement. A shift. A current neither of us tried to interrupt. I moved around the kitchen like always, poured water, measured coffee, opened the fridge without thought. But every motion felt slower, like the air had thickened. I reached for the top shelf, the silk stretching against my hips as I did. His voice broke the silence. "You always dress like this in the morning?" His tone was light, almost teasing, but I caught the hesitation behind it. I smiled without turning around. "Not always. Only when I feel like myself." He didn't answer, but when I turned, his gaze was steady, thoughtful. He took a sip of coffee, then asked if I wanted to go to the store with him. He needed a few things. Basic, everyday items. I said yes before thinking, and for some reason, the answer felt weighty. In the car, the silence was more comfortable. He drove with one hand resting casually on the steering wheel, glancing at me now and then. I kept my window slightly cracked, the wind lifting strands of my hair, giving me something to do with my fingers. At the store, we moved separately through the aisles, sometimes crossing paths. I handed him a jar from a top shelf. He brushed my hand when he took it. No apology, no hurry. Just skin against skin, warm and dry and completely deliberate. My breath caught, just slightly, but I didn't pull away. On the drive back, he put on music, something mellow, unfamiliar. I asked about it, and he talked about a band he used to listen to in college, how they reminded him of long drives and too much red wine. He looked at me for a second longer than necessary at a red light and said, "You don't look like someone who listens to music loudly." "Maybe I used to," I said. "Maybe I forgot." "You should remember." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't a suggestion. It was something gentler and more dangerous. Permission. I should have changed when we got home. I should have gone upstairs, retreated into routine. Instead, I lingered in the kitchen, washing fruit, slicing it slowly while he unpacked the bags. He stood behind me, close enough to feel, not close enough to touch. The air between us trembled. I turned to hand him a container, and something in the motion, too quick, too careless, made me stumble. He reached out, steadying my elbow. I looked up. That's when it happened. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't impulsive. It was like a question that had been hanging in the air finally answered itself. He kissed me. His hand still on my arm, his eyes barely searching mine before his mouth met mine. Soft, restrained, almost reverent. There was no urgency, no violence, just the trembling hush of a moment we both knew would come. I didn't pull away. His lips were warm, his breath steady. And in the middle of that quiet kitchen, with the hum of the refrigerator the only sound between us, My body said yes long before my mind could catch up. When he stepped back, I didn't look away. Neither did he, but neither of us spoke. He left the kitchen without a word, walked out the back door into the yard, disappearing around the corner of the house. I stood there, alone, my fingers still curled loosely around the edge of the counter like I needed to hold on to something solid. My heartbeat was everywhere. Ears, throat, chest, fingertips. There was no guilt. Not yet. No shame. Just something fierce and electric moving under my skin, something that had been asleep for too long and was now wide awake. Later, I went upstairs and stood under the shower for a long time, letting the hot water burn against my neck, my shoulders. I tried to breathe the moment out of me, wash it away like steam on a mirror. But it stayed. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, wet hair clinging to my cheeks, skin flushed. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. That night, I couldn't eat. I moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding the living room, the hallways where he might appear. But not because I didn't want to see him, because I wanted to too much. I needed to know if he would try again, if I would let him. At midnight, I heard footsteps outside my door, then silence. He didn't knock. I didn't open it. But I sat up in bed, holding my knees, eyes wide open in the dark, listening for every breath on the other side of the wall. My skin burned where he'd touched me, and part of me didn't want it to stop. I woke late the next morning. The light was already high through the window, casting sharp lines across the bedspread. The room felt too warm. The air too thick. For a long while, I lay there without moving, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muted sounds of the house. The clink of dishes, the creak of a floorboard. His movements. I could tell it was him. I rose slowly with a kind of practiced care, as if I were afraid of waking something fragile and sleeping inside me. I chose my clothes more deliberately that morning. A fitted blouse I rarely wore at home, soft gray trousers that clung slightly more than I was used to. Not provocative, not inappropriate, but considered. I paused longer in front of the mirror, brushing my hair back with my fingers, tucking a strand behind my ear. My lips were bare, but I pressed them together once, thoughtfully, as though checking if they still remembered. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty. A mug sat by the sink, still warm. I touched it without thinking, letting the ceramic heat seep into my palm. I poured coffee and sat by the window, pretending to read, but I wasn't really seeing the words. My mind was somewhere between yesterday's silence and today's noise, because everything felt louder now. Every step, every glance, every second spent in the same space as him. He came back from his run around noon, damp from rain that had started while he was out. I was folding laundry in the living room, the TV on low in the background, not watching. I heard the door click, the sound of wet shoes on the mat. Then footsteps. And then him, appearing at the edge of the doorway, his shirt clinging slightly to his skin, the dark fabric emphasizing the shape of his shoulders. A towel draped over his neck. His hair messy, curls sticking slightly to his forehead. Our eyes met for no more than a second, but it was enough to undo the thread of logic I'd been trying to keep tight all morning. "You got caught in the rain," I said, surprised by how even my voice sounded. He smiled faintly. "Didn't see it coming." "Do you want a dry shirt?" I asked, already setting down the fabric in my hands. He didn't answer immediately, just looked at me like he was thinking about something else entirely. Then he nodded. I didn't go to his room. I turned down the hall and opened the linen closet, pulling one of my husband's t-shirts from the lower shelf. When I turned, he was already standing behind me, towel now slung over one shoulder, arms crossed loosely. Close. Too close. I handed him the shirt without looking up, my fingers brushing his. He took it, but didn't move. "You look different today," he said. My stomach tightened. Different how? He tilted his head slightly. "Just like you see yourself again." I wasn't sure what to say to that. He was right. And he knew he was right. I could feel it in the weight of the silence that followed. He changed in the hallway without stepping away, just pulled the damp shirt over his head and dropped it to the floor. I kept my eyes carefully on the folded towels, on the neatly labeled shelves, on anything that wasn't the curve of his chest or the warmth of his breath just inches from mine. "I'll make tea," I said quietly, almost to myself. He didn't follow me, not immediately. But when I returned to the kitchen with 2 mugs, he was already there, leaning against the counter again, as if that was where he had always belonged. We drank in silence. The steam curled between us, softening everything. My heart didn't slow. Later that day, my husband called. I answered in the hallway. We talked about his meetings, his hotel room, the weather in the city. He asked how things were at home. I said fine. He said he'd be back late tomorrow instead of Friday. "I miss you," he added, almost as an afterthought. "I know," I replied, and I did. But I also knew it didn't change anything. After the call, I found myself staring at the photos on the wall in the stairwell. Old trips, smiles, moments frozen in time when I still believed that love was a set of routines done well, that it was enough. I passed his room on the way back to mine and hesitated. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the sound of quiet music played from his phone. He was lying on the bed, one arm bent behind his head, eyes closed. Peaceful, young, but not harmless. I watched him for a moment too long before retreating to my room and closing the door behind me. That night, my husband called again. I let it ring. I lay in bed, the room dark, the air too still again. My body remembered the touch of a hand that had steadied me, and for the first time, I didn't try to forget. The next morning, I woke before the sun had fully risen. A pale gray light slipped through the curtains, softening the room into something half-formed, unreal. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the silence. There was a heaviness inside me. Not guilt, not yet, but something unspoken that wrapped itself around my ribs and refused to let go. I dressed without much thought. A simple fitted dress that felt too formal for the day ahead, but I needed something structured, something that held me in place. Over it, I threw on a cardigan. Thin, soft, almost transparent. I didn't wear a bra. I didn't need to. The cardigan felt just right, covering enough but suggesting everything. A quiet rebellion no one would notice but me. And maybe him. The kitchen was empty again. The same 2 mugs still sat by the sink from yesterday. I picked them up, washed them slowly, one by one, running the sponge in small, careful circles. Every movement felt intentional, controlled. I heard him before I saw him, his footsteps descending the stairs, slower than usual. He paused briefly in the hallway, then stepped into the room with a calm that didn't match the tension stretching between us. He looked like he hadn't slept much. His hair was a little messier, his jaw slightly shadowed. He wore a plain black t-shirt and jeans, barefoot as always. I wondered if it was a choice or a habit. "Morning," he said, his voice low, hoarse from sleep. I nodded. "Coffee?" He shrugged but walked toward me anyway. I poured 2 cups. We stood there side by side at the counter, not touching, not looking. The silence between us was thick, not uncomfortable, just full. Like everything we weren't saying had taken shape and settled between our bodies. I moved to the stove, started preparing breakfast without asking what he wanted. I didn't care. It wasn't about food. It was about doing something with my hands, about not letting the weight in my chest take over. He stepped behind me to reach for a plate from the cupboard. I felt his body so close it sent a current up my spine. His arm brushed mine. Casual, deliberate. I didn't move. "You always this quiet in the morning?" he asked. "Only when I'm trying not to think." "What are you trying not to think about?" The question was light, almost playful, but I could feel the crack beneath it. He was pushing, softly, gently, but pushing nonetheless. Things I shouldn't, I said, turning toward him. Our eyes met. And there, in that one long second, everything was too real. He looked away first, picked up the plate. Fair enough. We ate at the kitchen table in silence, each of us chewing slower than usual, as though the act itself required more attention than it ever had before. I tried to focus on the taste, the texture, the warmth of the coffee sliding down my throat. But I couldn't. My thoughts kept looping back. To his mouth, to how it had felt on mine. To how easy it would be to let it happen again. After breakfast, I escaped to the living room under the guise of tidying up. I moved pillows that didn't need moving, wiped down a coffee table that was already clean. He followed me eventually, standing in the doorway like he wasn't sure whether to speak. You doing anything later? He asked. Why? I thought maybe you'd want to get out of the house. I turned to him. Go where? He shrugged. Anywhere. Doesn't matter. Just fresh air, change of scenery. It wasn't just about air. We both knew it. It was about space, about the illusion of normalcy, about pretending there was nothing dangerous about being alone together somewhere beyond the walls that had watched too much. I agreed before I let myself think too hard. All right, a walk maybe, or coffee. He smiled just slightly. I'll drive. We didn't leave until early afternoon. The rain had passed, leaving behind that kind of stillness only spring knows. The car ride was quiet. He played music again. Something older, slower. We passed through residential streets, then out onto wider roads lined with trees just starting to bloom. I watched them blur by, my fingers resting on my lap, tightly interlocked. He pulled into a small parking lot beside a narrow trail, the kind people used for weekend jogs or dog walks. It was empty. We walked in silence for a while, side by side, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath our shoes and the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. He didn't look at me. I didn't look at him. But the space between us pulsed. After a while, he stopped by a wooden bench, sat down. I remained standing, staring at the path ahead like it held an answer I hadn't yet earned. He leaned back, arms resting on the top of the bench, eyes up at the sky. You don't talk much. I talk when I have something to say. He looked at me then, really looked. Do you want to say something? I hesitated. I want to know what you think you're doing. He smiled faintly. I think I'm sitting on a bench, talking to a woman who's pretending not to want the same things I do. I blinked. Not because it shocked me, but because it didn't. Because he was right. And because hearing it aloud stripped something bare. That's not fair, I said quietly. But it's honest. I sat beside him, not touching, not close, but near enough to feel the pull between our shoulders. I'm married, I said, the words sounding thinner than I'd meant them to. You think I don't know that? I didn't answer. We sat in silence for a long time. Then I stood up. Let's go. He followed without question. On the drive back, the silence was heavier than before. Not uncomfortable, but inevitable. We didn't speak. Didn't need to. When we got home, I went straight upstairs, stripped off my dress, stood in front of the mirror in nothing but the cardigan. I didn't feel ashamed. I didn't feel beautiful. I felt exposed. Real. Like my skin was no longer just skin, but something raw, awake. I pulled open the drawer where I kept the lingerie I rarely wore. Not for anyone else. For myself. I touched the lace of a dark red set I hadn't looked at in years. My fingers trembled slightly. I didn't put it on. Not yet. But I knew I would. Soon. Downstairs, I heard his footsteps. Slow, heavy. I didn't go to him, but I didn't want him to stop walking. The next day began with a strange sense of stillness, not the kind that invites peace, but one that presses against the skin like the air before a storm. The house was unusually quiet, like it too, was holding its breath. My husband had left earlier than expected, a sudden change in his schedule. Something about a meeting that had been moved up. He kissed me quickly before walking out the door, already speaking into his phone as he closed it behind him. I watched from the window as his car disappeared down the street. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel guilt either. Just the deep, weighted awareness that nothing in my body responded to his departure. No longing, no missing, just space, opening up around me like an invitation I didn't yet have the courage to accept. He, my stepson, was still asleep, or at least pretending to be. His door was shut, and I didn't knock. I moved through the morning with quiet restraint, cleaning surfaces that didn't need cleaning, adjusting picture frames by a millimeter, folding and refolding towels that had already been folded. I was delaying something, anticipating something. I could feel it in my spine. By noon, he was up, dressed, and sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of orange juice and an unread newspaper in front of him. I poured myself coffee, pretending not to look at him, but every inch of me was aware of his presence, his silence, the way he didn't look away when I finally met his gaze. I was thinking, I said carefully, about going to that antiques place, the one off the highway. He blinked once, surprised but not confused. Today? Why not? You said you were bored. Come with me. A pause, then a nod. All right. We didn't say much as we prepared. I changed into jeans and a light sweater, a soft cream color that hugged the curve of my waist. Underneath, I wore the dark red lingerie I had touched yesterday. Lace against skin, smooth, tight, unnecessary, but necessary. My little secret, resting against my body like a whispered confession. He waited for me by the car, leaning against the passenger side with a calmness I didn't trust. We didn't speak as I slid into the driver's seat. I turned on the engine, the radio, adjusted the mirrors. My hands were steady, my heart less so. The drive was long, through stretches of nothing, the kind of roads that exist outside of time. He played music from his phone, low, something acoustic and slow, matching the rhythm of the landscape passing by. Why antiques? He asked eventually. I shrugged. I like the way they carry stories, even the broken ones. He glanced at me. You think broken things still matter? I didn't look at him. I think sometimes they're the only ones that do. We drove another 15 minutes in silence. When we arrived, the antique store was almost empty. Rows of aging furniture, dusty chandeliers, shelves crowded with glassware and forgotten porcelain. I wandered with intention, trailing fingers across wood and brass, letting the silence between us grow thick and electric. He followed. Not too close, not too far. I could feel him watching me, though I never turned to look. In a far corner, I found a small vanity table with a cracked mirror. I bent to inspect one of the drawers, and I heard him step behind me. His presence settled over me like a shadow. My fingers trembled slightly on the brass handle. You'd look good in front of that, he said quietly. I stood slowly, turning to face him. You think so? He didn't answer. His gaze moved slowly across my face, down to my collarbone, pausing at the way my sweater clung to the curve beneath my chest. When his eyes met mine again, something passed between us. Impossible to name, but undeniable. We left without buying anything. On the drive back, the silence wasn't calm. It buzzed, alive with what hadn't yet happened. I'm tired, I said, just before we hit the turnoff to home. You want to stop somewhere? I glanced at him. There's a place, a motel, by the trees. I remember it. He didn't ask why. He just nodded. We pulled into the gravel lot of a modest roadside motel, the kind that hadn't been updated in years but wasn't quite run down. I walked inside first, asking for a room with 2 keys. I didn't stutter. I didn't look back at him. The woman behind the counter gave me a knowing glance I ignored. Inside the room, everything felt muted. Faded curtains, beige bedspread, a hum from the ancient air conditioner in the wall. I stood near the door, holding the key in my hand, not sure whether to sit, to speak, to move. He stood in the middle of the room, still, watching me. I looked at him. Really looked. And there was nothing hesitant in his expression. No fear. Just certainty. A stillness that pulled me like a tide. "I'm going to shower," I said. He nodded. In the bathroom, I stood in front of the mirror again. This one had a crack across the corner, like the vanity earlier. I peeled off my sweater slowly, letting the lace beneath catch the light. My skin flushed from the inside. My pulse was fast and steady. I didn't look at my face. When I opened the door to the room again, he was sitting on the bed, not watching the TV, not on his phone. Just there. His eyes met mine. I didn't speak. He stood, walked toward me. And then, the kiss was nothing like the first. It was slower, deeper, the kind that doesn't ask permission because it already knows the answer. His hand rested on my waist, then slid to my lower back. The lace of my lingerie pressed between us, and I knew he could feel it. I wanted him to. When we finally pulled apart, he didn't say anything. Neither did I. We sat on the edge of the bed, our breathing still uneven. He leaned back, legs stretched out, head against the wall. I lay beside him, fully dressed, shoulder to shoulder, not touching, but close enough to feel every movement. After a long while, he whispered, "You didn't have to bring me here." "I know." "Then why?" I turned my head toward him, because I didn't want to pretend anymore. He closed his eyes. Neither do I. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the cheap curtains beside the window. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint outline of a water stain near the light fixture. In that small, forgotten room, everything felt impossibly real. And I didn't want to leave. When I returned home, he was downstairs, sitting on the couch in the exact way I'd seen him that first night. One leg over the other, eyes on the muted television, posture too relaxed to be comfortable. I stood in the doorway for a long second, watching him from behind the wall, unnoticed. The light from the screen painted soft shadows across his face, but his eyes weren't watching the images. He wasn't really there. I stepped into the room quietly, but not trying to hide my presence. He glanced at me, then back at the screen, as though I were just another part of the house. A clock ticking, a creak in the floorboard, nothing to question. "Did you get everything?" he asked, his voice even, unreadable. "Yes," I said. My voice sounded unfamiliar in the silence between us. I set the bag on the kitchen counter, though it was mostly empty. I hadn't gone to the store. I hadn't even tried. I moved slowly around the room, tidying things that didn't need tidying. I didn't look at him, but I felt his eyes following me. Not every second, but enough. Finally, I turned to face him. "You didn't say anything." He blinked once. "About what?" I stared at him, waiting. He didn't move. He didn't blink again. "About yesterday," I said. The word dropped like glass on tile. He sighed softly and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I didn't know what there was to say. There was a long silence between us. Not empty, not quiet. Just dense with everything we hadn't said in that motel room. Everything we'd allowed to happen, and everything we hadn't yet decided it meant. "I didn't bring you there because I was bored," I said. "And I didn't kiss you because I was confused." "I know," he said. I looked away. "Then why are we pretending nothing happened?" He stood slowly, walked toward the window, pulled the curtain slightly to the side, looked out into the empty street. His voice was low when he spoke again. "Because if we say it out loud, it becomes real. It is real." He turned then, finally looking at me, and there was something in his face I hadn't seen before. Something torn, something conflicted. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. Or him. "You think I don't?" That silenced him. We stood in the middle of the room, separated by just a few feet, but feeling like opposite sides of a cliff. "I didn't ask for this," I whispered. He walked slowly toward me, stopping just short of touching. Neither did I. And then, for a moment, we stood there, so close I could feel his breath again, the familiar pull that had already undone so much. But he didn't move, and I didn't reach for him. We didn't kiss. Instead, he stepped back. His hands dropped to his sides. He exhaled like he'd been holding something in for hours. "I'm going for a walk," he said. I nodded, watched him leave. The door closed behind him with a click that felt final, but it wasn't. That night, my husband tried. He came home with wine, flowers, neither of which we ever bought without a reason. He said he missed me, touched my waist while I cooked, tried to kiss my neck like he used to. I let him. Not because I wanted to, but because part of me needed to know if anything was still there. His hands were familiar, his breath warm, his body close. But everything inside me was frozen. I didn't flinch. I didn't stop him. I didn't even close my eyes. But I felt nothing. Later in bed, I lay beside him while he slept, breathing slow and steady, one arm stretched across the sheet like he still believed we shared something intimate. I turned away from him, pulling the blanket up to my chest. Across the hall, a light was still on under the guest room door. I watched it through the crack in mine, waiting for it to go dark. It didn't, and I didn't sleep. Because now that I knew what it felt like to be seen, I couldn't go back to being invisible. The next morning, I woke to a soft gray light pressing against the window panes. My husband was already gone. He had an early client meeting, and he'd left without waking me. The indentation of his body still lingered on the mattress beside mine, the sheets warm and crumpled, but the space felt colder than usual. I reached out instinctively, fingertips brushing the fabric, and then pulled my hand away. The sensation of skin on cotton reminded me of another bed, a smaller room, a different kind of silence. I sat up slowly. My body was sore, not from effort, but from tension. Tight in the shoulders, the lower back. Muscles that had been held too long in stillness. I reached for my robe but didn't put it on. Instead, I stood in front of the mirror in just my slip, watching the way the fabric moved against my skin. I tilted my head, pulled my hair into a loose knot, then let it fall again. I didn't look for beauty. I looked for clarity. I didn't find it. Downstairs, I made tea, not coffee. I needed something quieter, something that didn't sharpen my senses any further. The house was still. There was a note on the counter from my husband. "Back late. Don't wait up." I didn't know whether I was relieved. His son, my stepson, had not yet come down. The door to his room was closed. The hallway outside, it was empty and quiet. I stood at the bottom of the stairs longer than I meant to, mug warming both hands, listening for movement. At noon, I left the house. I told myself it was aimless, that I needed air. But I knew where I was going before I turned the key in the ignition. The boutique sat at the edge of a quiet shopping plaza, tucked between a florist and a tailor's shop. I had passed it 100 times before without ever stepping inside. Today, I opened the door and was greeted by the soft chime of bells and the scent of jasmine and wood polish. The saleswoman approached, smiling too brightly. I told her I was just looking. I wasn't. I ran my hands along silk, lace, fine cotton. Picked up one piece, then another, then another. My eyes caught on a dark navy slip, simple in cut, but delicate in its detail. Thin straps, barely there lace at the hem. Understated but undeniably intimate. "Gift?" the woman asked. I shook my head. "For myself." The words surprised me. She smiled. "That's even better." I left the store with a small black bag and a sharper awareness of my own reflection in the glass as I passed. I didn't go home right away. I drove to a quiet lookout point just outside town, overlooking the water. I sat on a bench and watched waves gather and collapse over and over again, dissolving at the shore. I thought about permanence, about the stories we tell ourselves when we need to survive, about the ones we abandon when survival becomes too lonely. By the time I returned home, the sun was low. The hallway was bathed in gold light. His door was open. He was sitting at the foot of his bed, elbows on his knees, eyes on the floor. He looked up when he heard me. I paused in the doorway, still holding the boutique bag in one hand, unsure of what to say. "Where were you?" he asked. I hesitated. "Out." His eyes flicked to the bag. "For him?" I didn't answer. He stood slowly, walked toward me, but stopped just short of reaching. His voice was softer than I expected. "I don't want to be a mistake you regret." I met his gaze. "You're not a mistake." We stood there, the silence stretching and curling around us like smoke. His breath deepened, and he looked at me the way someone looks at something they want but are afraid to take. My heart beat slower, but deeper, as if it were waiting for permission. Then I stepped forward. Just one step, but it closed the distance. He reached for my wrist, gently, his thumb brushing the inside where my pulse was racing. He didn't pull me closer. He didn't speak. I did. "Come to me tonight." His grip on my wrist didn't tighten, but I felt the tremor in his fingers. He nodded once. Not quickly, not urgently, just enough. I left him standing there and went to my room. I took the slip from the bag and laid it across the bed, smoothing the fabric with both hands. I showered slowly, letting the water wash away whatever had been holding me back. When I stepped out, I dried myself without rush, lotion on my arms, perfume on my neck. Not too much. I brushed my hair, put on the navy slip, watched how it clung to my body, how the thin straps made my shoulders look more exposed, how the hem caught the curve of my thighs. I didn't feel like a wife. I didn't feel like a mother. I felt like a woman who had stopped apologizing for being alive. And just as I turned toward the door, there was a knock. Quiet. Barely there. I opened it without hesitation. He stood on the other side, barefoot, wearing a plain white t-shirt and gray sweatpants. His hair was still damp. He looked at me the way a person looks when they've run out of reasons to pretend. We didn't speak. He stepped inside. The room was silent, but everything in us was already screaming. The door closed behind him with a muted click, and the sound settled into the room like something final. He stood still just inside the threshold, his gaze sweeping over me in a way that was neither hurried nor hesitant. Not lustful. Not aggressive. Just full. As if I were something he had been trying not to see clearly for too long. And now that he finally had, he didn't know what to do with the truth of it. I stood by the window, the navy slip brushing against my thighs, the fabric cool against freshly showered skin. My arms were folded across my chest, not to hide, but to hold something in. We were only a few steps apart, but it felt like a crossing. A boundary neither of us could take lightly anymore. What had once been glances and touches, suggestion and silence, now stood fully formed in front of us. I turned first. Not toward him, just slightly, enough to show I wasn't afraid. He moved then, slowly, and sat on the edge of my bed. His eyes never left mine. "This isn't going to go away," I said. "I know," he replied. His voice was low, steady. "I don't want it to." For a long moment, I said nothing. The only sound was the faint hum of the outside world. Distant cars, wind against the glass. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation and something softer beneath it. Not romance, not fantasy. Just the aching closeness of two people who had crossed an invisible line and could no longer return. "You should know," I said. "I'm not running from my life. I'm not broken. I'm not searching for an escape. I never thought you were." "Then why?" He looked at his hands, then back at me. "Because you make me feel like I'm not invisible, like I matter." The answer hit me harder than I expected, because it mirrored something inside me, something I hadn't yet admitted, even to myself. The deep, painful longing to be seen, not admired, not wanted, but seen. The way he looked at me, it was different. Not about possession or admiration. It was closer to reverence, and that terrified me. I sat beside him, the edge of the bed creaking softly beneath our weight. Our arms touched, just barely. I don't know how to be around him anymore, I said after a while. Your husband. I nodded. What changed? Everything, I whispered. And nothing. The silence between us thickened, not awkward, not hesitant, just honest. Have you told him? He asked. No. Will you? I don't know yet. He didn't push. He just sat there with me, quiet, letting the weight of everything we weren't saying rest between us. I could feel his warmth, the rhythm of his breath, the way his fingers curled slightly on the bedspread. The restraint in him was visible, almost noble, and it made the ache in my chest deepen. Eventually, he stood. I looked up, startled. You're leaving? Not far. I watched him cross the room, pause at the door. His hand rested on the knob, and for a second, I thought he would turn around, say something. But he didn't. He left. And I sat there in the silence of the room he had just occupied, still wearing the slip, still warm from his nearness, still caught in the echo of what hadn't happened. Downstairs, the front door opened minutes later. My husband's voice called out. Casual. Tired. I'm home. I didn't answer. I changed quickly, pulling a sweater over my head, jeans instead of silk. I folded the slip and tucked it away in the bottom drawer, out of sight but not out of mind. Then I went downstairs. He was in the kitchen pouring a drink. He turned when I entered, smiling faintly. Did you eat? Not yet. I picked up something on the way back. You want a plate? I nodded. We sat across from each other like we had 1,000 nights before, the clink of forks and glasses filling the space where words once lived. He told me about his meetings, a difficult client, some trivial detail about traffic on the freeway. I listened, or pretended to. I didn't ask about his day. I didn't tell him about mine. After dinner, he tried again. Not in words, but in touch. A hand on my back as I washed dishes, a kiss behind my ear as I dried them. He was trying, in his own way. But it was too late. His touches didn't ignite anything. They no longer found the right places. They wandered without landing, like echoes in a room that had been emptied of sound. That night, in bed, I turned away from him. Not coldly. Not spitefully. Just quietly. He placed a hand on my hip, pulled himself closer, and I didn't stop him. But I didn't respond either. I stared at the wall, the darkness thick, my breath steady but hollow. His arm tightened around me, searching for something that was no longer there. In the morning, he was already gone again. I made coffee for one. Across the hall, the guest room door was shut. I stood in front of it, my hand raised, knuckles almost grazing the wood. But I didn't knock. Not because I didn't want to. Because I wanted to too much. And that was the most dangerous part of all. The morning moved slowly, as if time itself had grown cautious, uncertain of how to proceed. I stayed in the kitchen longer than I needed to, staring out the window while the kettle screamed itself into silence. The fog outside the glass was dense, almost theatrical, blurring the world into soft silhouettes. It matched the fog inside my head, inside my body. This sensation of not quite being anywhere, but painfully aware of everything. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't go to his door. But every part of me was there already, curled against it like breath against wood, waiting. By midday, I couldn't sit still. I showered without reason. I dressed without a plan. I chose a dress I hadn't worn in years, a loose linen piece the color of salt. It didn't hug me. It didn't announce me. It simply moved when I did, catching wind in its folds like it had something to say, something it couldn't quite form into words. I didn't wear makeup, just perfume. Something soft, warm, close to skin. I left the house. No note, no explanation. I needed the day to hold me somewhere else. Somewhere without walls I had betrayed, floors that remembered footsteps that should never have been there. I walked without direction, the city unfamiliar under the weight of what I now carried. I wandered into a small bookstore I hadn't visited in years. The owner remembered me. I pretended to remember her too. I picked up a book I didn't read, drank coffee I didn't taste, nodded politely at strangers whose faces blurred past me. And still, he was with me. In the way I noticed the shape of a man's shoulders in a passing reflection, in the memory of his breath when I leaned too close to the steam rising from my cup. Around 5, my phone buzzed. Just once. A message. From him. Are you all right? 3 words, nothing more. No demand, no accusation, just concern. I didn't answer. I turned off the screen and placed the phone face down. But my hands were trembling. When I returned home, the sun had begun to dip. The house looked calm from the outside, deceiving in its stillness. Inside, the silence was sharper. He wasn't downstairs. His door remained closed. The kitchen light was on. 2 plates set on the counter, 1 untouched. He'd waited, and then given up. I stood in the hallway for a long moment before walking upstairs. I didn't knock. I didn't open his door. Instead, I returned to my own room and packed a small overnight bag, 2 dresses, a scarf, a book, the navy slip. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know how long I would stay. I just knew I couldn't be here tonight. Downstairs, I left the bag by the front door and poured myself a glass of water. I sat at the kitchen table in silence until I heard movement above. His footsteps. Slow. Purposeful. He came down wearing a jacket, phone in hand, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. He didn't speak at first. Just stood there, watching me the way you watch something precious that's slipping through your hands. You're leaving, he said finally. I nodded. Just for a night. He stepped closer. Alone? Yes. Does he know? No. He looked at me for a long moment, then let his eyes fall to the bag by the door. Where will you go? I haven't decided. He exhaled, ran a hand through his hair. I thought, I don't know, that maybe this wasn't over. It's not. Then why are you running from it? I'm not, I said quietly. I'm making space to breathe. He stepped back as if that answer hurt more than it should have. I stood, picked up my bag, and walked past him to the door. My hand rested on the handle. Then I turned. I never felt alive in my skin until you looked at me like that. He didn't move. I need to know if that version of me exists when I'm alone. Still, he didn't move. So I left. The motel was quiet. The same one. Familiar in its plainness. I chose a different room, one without a memory etched into its walls. I unpacked slowly, methodically, as if the act itself might bring order to the storm inside my chest. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling for hours. At some point I cried. Not from pain, not from regret. From the overwhelming realization that I was now someone else, and that I couldn't unknow what I had become. In the morning, I woke before the sun. I dressed without thought. The linen dress again? Simple. Honest. I checked out. Drove without music. Without coffee. Without direction. The beach was empty at that hour. Only the gulls and the wind. He was already there, sitting on the same bench we'd once passed on our way to nowhere. He didn't look surprised. He didn't stand. I walked across the sand in silence, the wind pulling at my dress, wrapping it around my legs like a second skin. I sat beside him. Not touching. Not speaking. For a long time, we just watched the waves. I thought you wouldn't come, he said eventually. I wasn't sure I would. What changed? I didn't want the last thing we shared to be silence. He nodded slowly. I didn't want that either. We sat there, the sea crashing softly in front of us, 2 people who had stepped too far off the path to return to where they began. I don't know what happens next, I said. Neither do I. I looked at him. You didn't ruin my life, I said, my voice steady. You gave it back to me. And he turned then, eyes wide, mouth slightly parted like he'd been holding that breath for hours. But still, we didn't touch. We just watched the horizon. And for the first time in a long, long while, I didn't feel like running.